Hello and welcome to In the Word. Exciting day today. We are in a new book of the Bible. We're in the book of Galatians. Set this book in context of the Bible and our reading from Romans to Revelation. Romans was an intensely theological book. Paul went through sin and salvation, sanctification, service to our Lord in those chapters. The books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians were intensely practical. Paul is addressing specific issues in the church in Corinth in those two books and gives us a model and an example of how to deal with problems in the church today. In Galatians, we get back to an intensely theological book again. This book was written very early in Paul's career. And several people have noticed that it seems to be the book of Romans in miniature. So a lot of the things that Paul talked about Romans extensively, again, with regard to sin and salvation and sanctification and the sovereignty of God and service, he addresses much more concisely in the book of Galatians. So you may observe that as you go through it today. If we look at the book of Galatians as a whole, people usually divide it into three sections of 2 chapters each, so 6 chapters altogether. One way is to look at it as having the right word in chapters 1 and 2. I'm looking at my notes here. The right standing before God in chapters 3 and 4, and right living in chapters 5 and 6. Others have looked at it and divided it into the gospel of grace defended in chapters 1 and 2, the gospel of grace explained 3 and 4, and in chapters 5 and 6, the gospel of grace applied. I particularly like that outline because it emphasizes Paul's main burden in this book about defending the gospel of grace. So critical is this that Paul dispenses with his usual pleasantries at the beginning of the book, greeting the church, praying for the church, and gets right to the issue. So when we look at this book, Galatians, we see in chapter 1, the first 10 verses are addressing the problem, and then verses 12 through the end of the chapter 23 talks about the divine origins of the gospel of grace. It's very important here, very critical. I'd summarize this chapter by saying that the gospel of grace is divine revelation. The gospel of grace is divine revelation. As you go through the book, as we begin reading today, I want you to note how passionate, aggressive, even in some cases sarcastic Paul is as he discusses and defends the gospel of grace in this book. And it's really asking a very simple question, a question that was posed by Job, perhaps the first book written in the Bible, first book of the Bible that was written. And in an early chapter of Job, chapter 9, verse 2, Job raises the questions, how can a man be right before God? That's what this book is addressing and defending. And it's a profound question. And it's a question that all religions have to deal with. And they deal with it in a common way. They mix the grace of God with human achievement in order to secure his approval or salvation. I've got some examples here. Let me just read some to you. The Roman Catholic Church in the Council of Trent, which really defines Catholic doctrine, was in the late 1500s. It was a reaction to the Reformation, and it was a systematic statement of what the Catholic Church affirms, which has never been changed, has not been recanted. They define justification, that is being declared righteous before God or acceptable to God, as a process. This process starts with baptism, continues through death, and the Catholic is made more holy in their nature and actions. And if they die with unrepentant mortal sins, then he is sent to hell. So in Catholic theology, there's venial sins, which are relatively minor, mortal sins, which are major. If you die in mortal sin, your salvation is lost. Islam also addresses this question. Let me read part of the Quran to you, Surah 23, verses, they're equivalent to verses 102 and 103, teaches that if good deeds outweigh bad, then the Muslim will be accepted. Here's what it says. Then those whose balance of good deeds is heavy, they will be successful. But those whose balance is light will be those who have lost their souls. In hell they will abide. So if your good deeds outweigh your bad, you're saved. If your bad deeds outweigh your good, you're lost. Let me read one more here. Particularly relevant because Mormons are active in the sharing of their heretical faith. Moroni 10:32, which is in the Book of Mormon, teaches that we must deny all ungodliness, then his grace perfects us. And then 2 Nephi 25:23 says that we are saved by grace, which sounds good up to that point, after we have done all that we can do. So God's grace is kind of our backstop. We do everything that we could possibly do, and then God's grace steps in and finishes the work for us, which again is unbiblical, as you'll see. And let me suggest also and warn you that there is a group on Facebook, if you're in Facebook, called Bible Study. And they seems innocuous enough. They pose questions and discuss within the group. But there's several Mormons that are involved with that. And I brought it to the attention of the admins several times. But the Mormons continue to be active in that group. So it looks like a group that's violating something Paul's going to talk about here, and something we need to be on guard against, which is those who would compromise the gospel of grace. So let's look at this closely. In verses 1 through 10, I say that we have the problem defined in abandonment of the gospel of grace. And Paul warns us about the problem that we're facing here. Right now he says in verse 4, we're living in an evil age. 2 Corinthians 4:4 says it's an age that's ruled by Satan. So we live in a time where evil abounds, and the message of evil is being spread everywhere. Verse 6, he says clearly that a different gospel is in fact no gospel at all. That if you take the gospel of God's grace and you adulterate it in any way, then it is no longer the gospel of God's grace. It's become a lie. Phrase I've heard before, and I use it frequently, is the skin of the truth stuffed with a lie. It sounds good superficially, but when you dig in, you find out that it's full of filth and corruption. And that's what this other gospel is, a gospel that's devoid of God's grace. In verse 7, he sees some of the personal impact of what's happening. It's troubling the Galatians. A deviation from the gospel of God's grace is internally, emotionally troubling. It puts on you, as you'll see when we get to the book of Colossians, guilt and shame, and you never measure up. You're never enough apart from God's grace. So it says it troubles you, and the gospel is being distorted. In other words, their minds are being confused. And brothers and sisters, confusion is the fertile ground where false teaching grows. Finally, he talks about it being a contrary gospel, and it's repeated again in verse 9, that this is a gospel that's contrary to the gospel that they've heard, contrary to the gospel that's been preached to them, contrary to the gospel that's in the Bible. And Paul says those who spread such distorted gospel are accursed. The Greek word here is anathema, a sentence to eternal conscious torment in hell. Paul is not compromising here. He's not saying, well, we have a difference of opinion. Let's just agree to disagree. He is saying that this is the key doctrine, and that those who contradict this doctrine are emissaries from hell, and that's their source and that's their destination, is what Paul's saying. So again, we see clearly the problem. Verses 11 through 23, we see the divine origin of the gospel. Paul's going to emphasize this at the outset, and he's going to amplify it through the book. So he emphasizes it here, amplifies it later. He talks about the gospel in verse 12 being a revelation of Jesus Christ, that this has come to him. And I take revelation of Jesus as to mean a revelation that Jesus has made to Paul. I take this in a personal way, that this is not just a general reference to the teaching of Jesus, although it is, but I think Paul is making a claim here that he has gotten this revelation directly from Jesus. We'll see this again in Paul, that he claims, for example, to get the revelation about the rapture directly from Jesus. But I think that's the point that Paul's making here, that Paul heard this from Jesus. And the proof of this revelation that Paul received is in the following verses from 13 through 23, is the radical change that happened to Paul. He's basically saying that he is living proof of the truth of the gospel. I want to point out in these verses, and you'll see them as you go through it yourself, three things that Paul points to. First, his change in activity. He went from being a persecutor of the church, violently trying to destroy it, to one who is building up the church, preaching the gospel. Radical change. You recall from Acts chapter 9 that Paul attempted to start preaching the gospel, but people didn't trust him. They saw this is the guy that's been persecuting to the church, so he went back home basically and was at home until a need arose for him in the church, and Barnabas came and took him to the church in Syrian Antioch, which began Paul's ministry. So Paul had this radical change in his activity, and this is proof of the truth of the gospel, of its divine origin. Paul had an immediate change in ambition. He said he was at first zealous for the traditions of the elders. What he's talking about there is Paul was raised as a Pharisee. He was educated as a Pharisee. Pharisees were expert in the laws that they had established around the law of Moses. So their intention was to make sure that the law of Moses was not broken, and the way that they did that was putting laws around the law of Moses. So if the law of Moses says, keep the Sabbath day holy, then what the Pharisees would come in and say, okay, here's how to keep it holy. You can't carry more than a thimbleful of anything on the Sabbath. You can't walk more than their equivalent of a kilometer from your home on the Sabbath. They had a whole series of rules. You can't heal on the Sabbath, which they attempted to use to trip Jesus up. And so a number of rules. So Paul was expert. He was zealous for these things. He gave his life for them. That was his ambition. And then radically, immediately, he turned to preaching Christ. Preaching Christ to, of all people, the hated Gentiles. He went from being zealous for the tradition of the Jewish fathers to preaching the gospel of God's grace to the Gentiles. Radical change in ambition for Paul. And a radical, incredible change in his quest, in his life. Went from seeking the approval of men, pleasing his Pharisaic masters, trying to outdo his peers in observation of the laws and traditions of the fathers, to just pleasing Christ, just pleasing him. Radical change in Paul's life that proved the truth of the gospel. A couple things by way of application. I want you, first of all, to really learn the effect, the impact of the fall on us, how we have become totally and completely unacceptable to God, God's enemies. It says in Genesis 3:15 that there's enmity between us and God. He is against us. His desire is to destroy us until his anger and wrath is propitiated in Jesus Christ. Second, understand that salvation in all of its aspects is by grace alone. Not just at that moment of salvation where we are justified, although that's important that it is by grace alone that we are justified, but also in the present tense of salvation, in our sanctification and making us holy is also God's grace. And our future tense of salvation, where we'll be glorified in the presence of God, is also a result of God's grace. So all of salvation is God's grace. We can't break apart justification from sanctification and glorification. They all go together. And I pray, brothers and sisters, lastly, by way of application here, that you would embrace and even pursue the grace of God in your life, and particularly in your sanctification. It's normal in our Christian life to be changed by our understanding of the gospel. That's the normal situation that's been presented in the New Testament. Not that we have to make that change to prove our salvation, but it's a fruit of our salvation. I embrace you to engage and embrace the change that God is making in you by His Spirit, by His grace. That God is at work in you to draw you to Himself, that He wants you to be radically committed to Him, radically changed in your activities, radically changed in your ambitions, radically changed in what you are questing after in your life. I've gone a little long here. Sorry, I'm getting passionate. We should be passionate about the gospel. So God bless you, brothers and sisters. God bless you as you read the book of Galatians. May He use His word to work in you a knowledge and an appreciation of His grace. Talk to you tomorrow.